Today I have the pleasure of bringing to you an interview with Kelly Mellings, the illustrator of the award-winning The Outside Circle. And we talk a lot about craft and a little bit about style, and I think you'll really enjoy it. He's really brilliant, and the interview is quite interesting. So without further ado, we'll just dive right in. So thank you for joining my channel again today. I'm excited today because I get to have a guest on my video, and I get to talk to Kelly Mellings, who is a multi-award winning illustrator, and he's super awesome, and I'm so thankful that he's taken some time to talk to us, and I get to record it and share it with you guys. I wanted to do a video about craft and about the importance of craft and growing as an illustrator. And I thought to myself, I'm growing and I'm working at it, but there's nobody that I know that is better suited to talk about this than my friend Kelly Mellings, because he works tirelessly at improving his craft and has for years and years and years. So I'm excited to have you, Kelly. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us and to entertain my questions, and I know it's going to be informative for myself and for everybody listening. So thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much, Corey. Your video series have been really inspiring, so it's kind of awesome to be a part of it, and share what little knowledge that I do have about things. I have been working at things for a while. I wish it would show more in my work, but it's better. Looking at old stuff, it's better. So there's perhaps a nugget that we can get out of here.
Awesome. All right, well, so I sent you a series of questions which you've had a chance to kind of peruse, and so I kind of put these questions together just sort of like, I don't know, to help guide the conversation, I guess. And if there's anything that you want to add beyond what I've asked you here, like totally just go for it. So the first question that I thought was, like, when I was thinking about it for myself, and what I'd like to kind of get from your perspective is, like, what does craft mean to you?
So for me, craft in art is it's just like specifically those skills necessary to make the things. That doesn't mean that the things that you're going to make are good. It just means that you'll have the skills to make them. So I think the creative aspect and the idea aspect of art is like a separate kind of thing, or maybe even just a separate craft that you have to work on. And then the actual kind of main craft of artwork is those like visual fundamentals. And like when I think of it, I think of like the old school illustrators and old school masters that would spend days and hours, doing drawings from sculptures and life casts to get those fundamentals and to build that visual library.
Awesome. And like for you, where did that sort of start for you in terms of like development of craft, or when did you kind of become aware of it?
So when I was a kid, I realized, like when I was pretty young, that okay, you got to get good at the drawing part of stuff if you want to do illustration or comic books or whatever. And so I would grab books out of the library, and that was the only place I could get info at the time. And I would get them. I lived in Pigeon Lake, so we'd go to the library, and then my mom worked at the school, so I would photocopy the book, and I still have 2 or 3 books that are photocopied and then bound in the industrial arts room that kind of started on my journey. So for me, it was just kind of like realizing that okay, there's information out there that can help you get better at the craft part of things, and then building off that. And then I kind of worked that way for a while, and then when I moved to Leduc, I lived in Pigeon Lake before, so I moved to Leduc. All of a sudden, there was a bunch of artists that were already higher levels and better artists. So I realized that there was way more to learn. And then one of our friends, Nick Booth, really showed me that there's even more individual elements of stuff. So he's like, oh, did you know that the inker brings something different to the table? I'm like, what are you talking about? The inker just traces over the pencil. He's like, no. There's a craft to that too. So I started learning that each of these elements is its own separate craft, and started seeking out as much kind of at that time book knowledge. Now I'm, the podcast knowledge and video knowledge, whatever I can grab.
Cool. That's neat how like I think there's sort of like I don't know, from my perspective, there seems to be sort of like a point where as an artist you sort of become aware of what you're doing, right? Like because I remember as a kid drawing too, but as a kid I don't think I was super conscious of what I was engaging in. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like I don't know, maybe it was different for you, but I just kind of was like going through the motions and I knew I wanted to get better, but I didn't like stop and think like, oh, I'm working on this understanding or this craft. It was just like, it doesn't look right, so I got to keep drawing.
Yeah, and I think like any artistic pursuit, it starts out as kind of like it's fun to do, and then you get that buzz or that reward of getting better at it through a little bit of repetition, and all of a sudden you're a little bit better at other people, and you don't always know exactly why it is, but it's probably just because you did it a little bit more, and maybe a small natural inclination towards things, and I think it's like later on, like once you learn a little bit more, you start realizing like, okay, there's a certain set of rules that can help me out here, or if I do this works out better than when I do it the other way. So I think it starts out like a little bit of like a self revelation, and then it's like, okay, well, I need to learn some more about this. And I think you and I both have learned on our journey. Now that we've been professional artists for a while, you get a little bit higher on that ladder, and then you really see how high that ladder is, and you're like, oh wow, I thought I was, maybe in my 20s, I was like, whoa, I'm really high on this ladder of craft. And you get to now, and you're like, I'm like on the first run, and it's so high. So I think we both have kind of dug in and said, well, we either give up or we work really hard to get up a few more rungs before we're done with our art careers. So I think, both of us have kind of started really kind of pushing our personal growth as artists.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's pretty accurate. Now, you spent like 2 years working on a graphic novel, which I wanted to talk about a little bit here. So, The Outside Circle, and you worked on it with Patti LaBoucane Benson,
Mm-hmm.
and it's published through our buddies. Oh my goodness,
House of Anansi.
House of Anansi. Thank you. Wow.
No problem.
And so now I'm curious. I was curious about sort of like that process of doing that large of a project, and its relationship to your development as an growth as an artist, right? So I wanted to start just with if you could tell us a little bit about the Outside Circle. So just like kind of how did it come about? What's it about? And how is it important and relevant as a literary work today?
Okay. So I think it came about like all good things do, with like parts luck and parts preparedness, and then that opportunity being there. Um, we'd been doing our illustration company for a while, and I'd been doing comic books, and you and I have been doing comic books and telling stories with our pictures since we were little kids. And through Native Counseling Services, who Patti, who wrote the book, is the director of, they did a few educational comic books through us, and they turned out really good and had a really good response, and kids really picked up on them, and they were very popular resources for them. And Patty's a fan of the comic book medium, and she was just finishing up her thesis, and she because she liked the comic work we did and liked working with us and knew that we understood her research and some of the specific problems facing the First Nations community, and also just some of the positive work that she'd been doing. She approached us and asked me if I'd want to illustrate the graphic novel of her thesis, and I'm like, yeah, I think I need to be the person to do this, because we've seen firsthand how awesome her research is, and we've heard her speak so eloquently many, many times about it. And I felt like it was like a really challenging, near impossible task to translate such important information into a story. But I'm like, because of my love of comics and my respect for Patti and that kind of unique situation, I felt like maybe I could screw it up less than other people. Maybe because I was close with her and understood how important it was that we would get the right tone and feeling for it. Maybe better or different than someone else, but at least there's, I don't know. I think few people would have placed the importance that it deserved on it, and I think we could.
Hmm.
Yeah. What else? Why is it important? Well, it's Patti's thesis, or her research, centered around healing in Indigenous communities, and specifically around healing for men in Indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm.
And it talked about intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
That's something I didn't know about until I worked
Yeah.
with Native Counseling Services. And probably if I talked about it with my dad, I'm like, that's not even a real thing, whatever. And when I understood it, I'm like, oh, it's a real thing, and it affects a lot of people. And it's really hit hard in the Aboriginal community because of the effects of colonialism and all these laws that have been put into play. So what's happened because of the book, because it went through Canada's Best Publisher, because it hit at the right time, because Patti's story and research are so good, and because I didn't drop the ball with the illustration work, it became a national bestseller. There's been about 30,000 copies printed of it, which is pretty amazing considering, for a graphic novel, that would be, more than a bestseller in comic book stores. And it started a national conversation. It was up for Canada Reads. People were talking about the book. People, it's won several literary awards. So it's just gotten into a lot of hands. And this conversation wouldn't gotten into so many hands if we hadn't presented it in this format. Patti said she didn't want her dissertation, her life's work, 20 years of her work, to be sitting on a shelf somewhere. She wanted people to be reading it and talking about it. And it might not be as deep and complex as her whole research, to be encapsulated into something like this, but it really gets the conversation started, and it gives you an idea so that you can actually start talking about this and understanding our history a little bit more.
Absolutely. It's such a great, like in my experience with reading the book and seeing people react to it, it's such a great, opening to the conversation. It's really accessible. The medium is accessible, and it's easily digestible, and the way that you carried it out and everything, it just reads really well. It's cool.
And I mean, there was a lot of trust there too. There was trust in from Patti to let me tell that story, and because of that, she let me take some liberties with stuff because she trusted me. So that I would be like, well, what if we change the pacing of this? Or I think I get your point here. What if we did this? We could do it a little bit differently because I'm such a comic nerd. And she's like, oh yeah, that's what I was hoping for. So. I think that trust on both parts, and because she knew we did the research and understood the subject matter and the importance of it, that we were able to create something really, really good that uses the comic medium in a way that's the comic medium is best for. Like, there's a few pages there that you couldn't do in a movie, or you couldn't do in a book, or you couldn't do in a animation. It just works best as a comic book.
Yeah, for sure. And that sort of skill set of storytelling is really, you applied it really well. And it's a really neat collaboration, right? Because Patti had an interest in graphic novels, and that was partly why she thought of the medium, but she doesn't have the same breadth of knowledge, right, in terms of using it as a storytelling medium. Yeah,
I mean, she's been working, like, NCSA uses stories to get stuff across. So she's a great storyteller. She's one of the best public speakers I've ever seen. And when she's involved with their movies and documentaries, they're always just really solid. So it's not like it wasn't like there was any slack to pick up there, but because she was familiar with the comic medium, she had an idea of stuff, but because I'm just a little bit more entrenched, I'm like, okay, what if we did this, or could do this? Like, it's just like anything, right? If you're an Uber fan or a student of something, you're going to know a few more tricks and tips that can maybe bring things to the next level if allowed.
Yeah, for sure. So that is a good segue into the next question. So after 2 years of investing your time into the creation of this national best-selling graphic novel, and looking back on it, where you are now, sort of like if you're standing on two edges of a canyon, for example, and you've crossed to the other side of this canyon, and you're looking back at the journey that you went on to get there, to where you are. Like, do you have any reflections on how working through that project or working through a project like that impacts your growth in terms of your craft?
I think I think it helps. A big project, finishing a big project in any medium, is going to help you grow and help you get out certain things as an artist. So it'll help you work through some of that surface stuff, which we do as artists. That's kind of like the first thing that we gravitate towards. So oftentimes artists will start out imitating someone else. But if you're forced to draw a whole bunch of pages, you don't have time to keep looking back at whatever your favorite artists are, how they drew noses or they drew faces. You just start relying on your knowledge of structure, your understanding of how to draw an object instead of trying to use their solutions to those problems. And so I think a lot more of yourself starts coming through after you finish a larger project like that.
Interesting.
And you start realizing that, just drawing is more important than that surface style. And I think also just, I think some of the growth for me personally came from sticking things through and finishing stuff. It was a difficult time. While I was drawing the novel, we were experiencing some shrinkage as a studio, and we had to learn about that a little bit. I also lost my brother during that time, and I was drawing this depressing funeral scene in the comic like the day after. We were also getting one of it wasn't. We were experiencing like ups and downs as a studio, right? Because I think maybe we had like one of our biggest projects, and then I was still finishing it when we didn't have that anymore. So it was a lot of personal growth there, a lot of like just having to let go of it being perfect, and I think that really helped me. I have a real problem with being a perfectionist, and I think while I was illustrating the graphic novel, like we had to sit down and say, look, we need to get this done, because if you just spend all your time on this, we'll tank the studio. So it was like, okay, I need to actually get this done, and I'm not going to sacrifice quality, but maybe I need to be smarter about how I work, and maybe I don't need to draw every single rock somewhere, and just focus on the important stuff. And I think that really helped me. And I think after this comic, we both did a comic for Native Counseling Services, and I think we both finished ours in under a month. It was like, oh, okay, it's doable. You just have to find a better way to do it. I often will pick styles because we vary styles between projects for clients, and my tendencies are to pick styles that are very labor intensive, because I just really love the craft and I love making things beautiful. But I realized that helped me realize that, that's just because it's more labor intensive doesn't mean it's always the best. For that project, I still think that was the best style. I still could have been smarter about it. So, I mean, it was a lot of, there was personal growth, there was business growth, and then there was artistic growth through the project. It was
interesting.
One of the biggest things that I ever finished. So, yeah, those were some of the things I had to learn.
That's interesting. Do you think that like those personal aspects, like the pressures and the outside things, and like you're saying, like it kind of forced you in some ways to limit your the way that you're interacting with your work, right? Like you had to kind of pare down on certain things, and then just those sort of outside pressures and the emotional stresses and stuff. Do you think that there's a connection between, like in the grand scheme of that project, do those things inform the growth of your craft as much, or like is it hard to separate growth?
I think in this case, I mean, I'm sure lots of times you can have personal growth separate from artistic growth, but because it was personal growth that was the impetus was the comic book and the things involved around there. So I think in that way they're intertwined. I think in other ways it's like, well, if I want to fix my sleeping habits or whatever, that's going to be a separate thing from any artistic growth. But in this case, it was like, I think it made me a smarter artist. I think I make better choices because of it, and I think since I've found smarter solutions for projects that are just as good as the ones I would have done before the outside circle, but maybe don't take 500 hours.
Interesting. That's cool. Do you have any reflections on whether, like, just kind of going through this process now, and also like being dedicated to growth in your craft outside of this project? I'm wondering if you have any reflections on or what's your view on whether a person might find more growth through completing a project versus practicing their drawing skills through study devoid of like an end goal or narrative or story?
Um, I think you're going to find different growth. I think it's like I don't know. It's like training for the marathon versus the actual marathon.
Okay.
Both are really good and both are necessary. But eventually, you want to put that into practice on something,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're going to learn different things from that. So if you're learning anatomy and you're learning perspective, those are all going to be important things. But oftentimes, you're not forced to remember them until you're kind of like tested on them or until you have to implement them. And that's going to increase the growth there because you're going to be having to remember how to draw a three-point perspective for something instead of just practicing it and having the book right there all the time. And you're also going to be, forced to do things faster, and also I think once you put things into practice, then you start building on different skills. So I mean, I think the book helped my storytelling skills, which I wouldn't be working on otherwise.
Hmm.
Making sure that everything was clear and understandable, and to try and innovate as much as I could, panel-wise, while still making it clear to a new audience. Like those were skills that I wouldn't have worked on in my sketchbook. And I think I really grew there. Also letting go of style and just worrying about drawing things nicely, and to the best of my ability. That was something that I wouldn't have worked on as much in my sketchbook. I probably would have been, still looking at influences and trying to push things towards that. So those were things that I think I really grew on. But I mean, now I'm doing a lot of sketchbook studies and trying to learn in that way, and I feel like I'm growing in another way. So that when I do go back and I do another comic book, that I'm going to have better skills, and I'll probably be faster, and then I can, kind of implement things in a different way and grow again in my storytelling and in my kind of narrative sense there.
Cool. So what tools, materials, or inspiration do you use personally to push your own growth?
So I use I look online on Pinterest a lot. I use that a lot. I find it's really fun, and I can also like pin boards for specific projects, and you can have secret boards if you have a project that you're not willing to share with anyone yet. Books, I love books so much, and I'll sit down with them for a while and be like, okay, what can I get from this? And for learning stuff, but also for inspiration. So I mean, I've got my anatomy books for learning stuff, and my perspective books for learning that, and then I've got just books by Rackham or Ian McCaig or whoever that I can look at for just artist inspiration. A comic book still, I go to the dollar bins and just try and find random issues that are drawn, or fill-in issues that are drawn by my favorite people. And oftentimes they're cheap and they're fun, and they're just like, well, here's an issue done by one of my favorite guys that no one really cares about because it's nothing special happens to Spider-Man or whatever, but it's just an awesomely drawn issue. Those are the biggest areas. And then when we have a chance, like workshops, listening to artists, writers, storytellers speak about their craft is always inspiring, and hanging out with other people, it's really important. I feel like until I'm working with other people, it's kind of isolated and you don't get that excitement. But if you and I are writing or sketching, or if I have a few friends over and we have a beer and we're sketching like we used to in high school, that's when you get that that kind of your blood is boiling to make stuff, and you get excited about it, and you're like, oh yeah, this is why I do it. It's not just, it's tough because it's such an isolated, all this learning and all this, trying to grow as an artist and making stuff is often by yourself. But if you are in a studio environment, or if you get to spend some time with people who have the same interests and same kind of commitment to growth, that's when you get that kind of extra pick-me-up of stuff.
That's awesome. I agree. I find that like time spent with other artists is like so beneficial. It motivates and also challenges, right? Like it's
Yes.
It's really important.
And I mean, and I think some of our tendencies as artists too is to hide stuff too, because we're insecure about stuff too. Like
Hmm.
one minute we're the greatest in our heads, and then the next minute we're like, I shouldn't be allowed to hold a pencil. And so we don't want to show other people, and it's easy to blow off those kind of meetings. But when you're there, it's like, we're not ripping each other apart. We're like, oh, this is awesome. What if you did this? Or what if you did that? Or,
Yeah.
oh, I see what you're doing there. You should look at this guy who's, someone who's outside of your kind of pool of inspiration that all of a sudden opens up a new door to stuff. And you're like, oh yeah, that's totally what I want to do with things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's really good. And, we've experienced that through Drink and Draw before, or going to Life Drawing, or with the Society of Children's Illustrators.
Yeah.
Like those types of things are really, really good to bring people that are outside of your just usual circle too, and give you different perspective in that way.
Yeah, totally. You kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but I was curious about and this is kind of a question that keeps coming back to me in sort of my own learning and stuff, is around style. And I actually had a conversation about this with my aunt the other day. She's a potter, and she was talking
Oh,
about
neat.
style in relationship to pottery, which is interesting, right? But it's like,
Cool.
we were sort of having a conversation about style in relationship to commercial viability, right? It was kind of like what we were talking about. She was mentioning that there's certain types of pottery that people will gravitate towards in terms of purchasing, or
Mm-hmm.
wanting to sell and stuff like that. So as a potter, if you want to be commercially successful, you should kind of be working in a certain way, right?
Right.
But anyway, that's sort of a whole other kind of conversation. But I was curious about um, and particularly in relationship to sequential artists or sequential art, there's this sort of tendency to develop a quote unquote style, and then you become known for it, and that's kind of what you sort of perpetuate in your work, because it's the way you work, right? So it's comfortable,
Mm-hmm.
and you can produce it quickly enough and all that stuff for the industry. But I was wondering, in your mind, are craft and style tied together, or are they sort of separate monsters?
I think, well, they're tied together, but they're like separate things. So like style is a result of your choices, good and bad, and how to represent things. They're
Mm-hmm.
like, it's like your solution.
Mm-hmm.
Like how many lines I decide to represent an eye, that's going to be my style. And it's usually kind of subconscious. You're not thinking about it as much.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens is a lot of people will see the success in that. And it's just like when Hollywood sees, like, oh, okay, they made a Western
Yeah.
movie, so we'll make a bunch of Western movies because that's what's popular.
Right.
And so, in the 90s, we saw there was an artist, Jim Lee, who's so good. And he had a really kind of flashy style. He was paired with an inker, Scott Williams, who helped develop the style. And everything was kind of shiny and had this beautiful cross-hatching. And people copied the surface of that. And they had some success because of it. But none of them had the same lasting success as Jim did, because Jim also had this structure, the underlying fundamentals
Mm-hmm.
that are more important than the style. And that's, people weren't copying that; they were copying that surface stuff, right? And it was like,
Right.
in writing style, when Watchmen came out in the 80s, it's this graphic novel that people consider one of the best 100 books of all time. It was like changed the industry because it was very serious and grown up and treated kind of a kid's medium and superheroes in a serious way. And people copied the surface of that. And so they added more violence and sex in the comics. And it's like, well, that's not what made it good. That's not why it was good. It was
Mm-hmm.
good because it was well written, and it treated the medium as a legitimate kind of medium for telling stories. So it elevated it in that way. But people just copy the surface. And so I think that's what style is. It's the surface, and it really doesn't matter. You can make a pleasing surface on stuff, but if the underneath stuff isn't wonderful, at the end of the day, it's kind of, they say, like polishing a turd. You don't want to do that. So, and I focused on style so much early on. And I worried about the kinds of lines I made. And I looked at Travis Charest as one of my favorite artists, and he draws these eloquent, beautiful lines that seem like they weren't made by a human hand. And I tried to draw like that, and it was just the surface that I was copying. I wasn't trying to understand the forms underneath, or the way that he built his figures or anything like that. I was just looking at that surface stuff. And I think all artists will start out copying someone. And like Neil Gaiman said, we sound like a lot of people before we find our own voice, and that's really true with illustration. It's like you're gonna be, start out, oh, that guy's a copy of this guy, that guy's a copy of that guy. But if you keep working through it, that style stuff becomes less important, and it's the underneath stuff that becomes important. And you see good artists will evolve past that. And there might be little remnants of that, but all of a sudden it starts mixing in other styles and stuff, and all of a sudden you can recognize their structure instead of saying, well, that guy's a clone of this person. You're like, okay, that guy's influenced by these people, but they're not trying to be that person. And that's when I think they really kind of come into your own as an artist. And I think finishing a large project like that, like the Outside Circle, forced me to move past my influences like I would when I was doing like 3-page samples to comic book companies that would feel a lot like the artists that I liked. When I had to do a whole comic like that, it's like, well, I don't have time to try and mimic someone else. I just got to draw as good as I can, and there's some licks in there that are reminiscent of those people. But now when I get compared to someone, I get compared to people who are influenced by the same people. It's not like my stuff doesn't look like Travis Charest, but someone will say, well, it looks like Steve McNiven, this guy who obviously is super influenced by Travis Charest. Like, okay, so it's like my stuff is now filtered through me now, so it starts to feel more like my own.
And it is like it's layers almost, right? So you can have like a style, but if you don't know how to draw, like let's say you're trying to do something that's sequential that requires you to draw perspective and people, but you've never really studied that and you haven't taken the time to understand what you're drawing, then you can have a style and you might get a piece out there that would be quote unquote successful, but from a representational perspective, it may not be. Like there's a weird spectrum there, right? Where it's like, because you could have like for example, like Adventure Time. we talk about this all the time, right? But it's like goopy, right? And kind of like mess, like from the perspective of, if you were looking at it from the perspective of craft, in my opinion, and maybe this is another problem with it, is that it's very like subjective, right? So in my opinion, like, the art in Adventure Time is not a high level of craft, though I guess they're achieving what they want to achieve at a high level, right? So they're focusing in on this one sort of style and doing it well. So maybe that's a representation of craft, right? Successful craft. I don't know. Like, is that?
Yeah, and I mean, craft you can have different goals with your craft too, right? I mean, you can try if you want to work on your craft to draw something as representationally as you can and have it feel like a photograph, and that's a different skill than having something have a feeling of life. So drawing from life, but also exaggerating it like a good cartoon will, where it's like it's not just a person running. It's a feels like a person running, and there's more dynamism and excitement to the image than it would be if you had a photograph.
Right.
I think you can be successful with just a really, like, so if you work on that, so maybe that is that craft of the surface style. And so your example of Adventure Time, like, they've really nailed this really cool indie style, shaky lines. It's like a naive look to it, and they have these wacky character designs and these like offbeat stories that are like fun mashups of stuff that people like. So I think they've worked really, like, they've honed that craft, that element of the craft, but they haven't honed the other elements that you find really important.
Right.
And so that's and that's fine, but that's not a cartoon that appeals to you because of that, because you appreciate things that have a different element that's kind of missing from there. Sure. And you can appreciate elements that have that kind of Adventure Time look when they kind of address at least a little bit better some of the stuff that you like. So it's like, okay, you might like say, you could almost say like some of the no-brow press books almost feel Adventure Time, but there's more structure and more kind of traditional illustration skills that are kind of apparent through them. So when I show you like this fantasy sports book, or the Hilda books, you're like, oh, you respond more to those than you do to Adventure Time, even though some people would put them in the same wheelhouse because they have that other element that's been addressed.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think like it's important to remember like what you said, right? They've honed in on something, and stylistically they're approaching it in a way that fits well with what they're trying to do, right?
Yeah,
and so
it's like a band, right? Where you dial up certain notches, right? Where it's like, well, like a punk band isn't technically going to be playing as good as like a really good like math rock band, but they dial up the emotion, they dial up this rawness and maybe lyrics that appeal to people,
Right.
And all of a sudden it's really appealing to a certain audience because the things that they pay attention to are being addressed. It's when we were kids in the 90s again too, there's a few artists like Rob Liefeld who people either have a visceral love or visceral hate from, and he was one of the most popular artists. A lot of people look back at it now because his structure is crazy and he ignores backgrounds and doesn't draw feet lots of times. But he focused in on that line work that people loved and took it to the extreme. And it was like, here's just a background of some hatching. Here's some smoke that people like. Here's crazy, angry characters with swords. And you like pouches? I'll put a bunch of pouches. So he dialed up all these exciting notches that like 13-year-old boys were like, that's what's awesome about
That's true.
comics. And people loved him. And, I enjoyed his stuff then. And it was exciting.
Yeah,
you're looking at it now, it's like, whoa. He got away with a bunch of stuff, but he really dialed in. He's like a punk rock.
He gamed the system.
Yeah, it was like he was like a punk artist, right? It wasn't about trying to draw as good as everyone else. He's like, how can I make this more exciting?
Yeah, for sure.
How can I make this awesomer?
Yeah, yeah, and there's a skill like that requires a lot of skill too, right? I mean, in a sense, I mean. It's like deliberately sort of finding what works, right? And just working in that. Anyway, sorry. Let's move on. We could talk about style is a weird thing for me. I don't know if I'm obsessed with it or something, but I always come back to it, and I could talk about it all day.
It's really interesting. I was also thinking like before we move on, like I think it's important to push outside of your comfort zone for growth style-wise.
Right.
So I think one of the things that have helped us, and maybe he's confused you style-wise, is as a studio, we don't have like a set style. It's not like we have a project and it's like looks like Corey drew it or Kelly drew it. Mm-hmm. We like to say our style is that craft, right? So we say like, it's going to structurally be good. It's going to feel like, like when you get a chair made by a craftsman and they really cared about making sure it doesn't fall apart when you sit on it.
Right. And then like, we tailor the style to meet the story needs, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Based on audience and tone and all those things, which is like, that's sort of that's when style. And you see, I guess for me, maybe it's because we run things from that mindset that I guess maybe I see style a little bit differently, I guess, in a sense.
We see it more malleable, I think.
Yeah.
Whereas, say one of my favorite artists in the world, and I think one of the most talented artists in the world, Mike Mignola, he draws like Mike Mignola. And no matter what story he's telling, it's drawn like Mike Mignola. But he decided early on that he only wanted to draw certain kinds of stories. Mm-hmm. And so his style just evolved into that. Yeah. And he's like, I like shadows, I like mood, I want to draw monsters, I don't like drawing cars. And when he's a guy who made up Hellboy, and he's like, he drew like a couple issues of Hulk and Thor and stuff, and he's like, I really like guys when they fight monsters, so he's like, I'll make a character that fights monsters, and he's like, if I make the guy fighting monsters a monster, then I don't have to hardly draw any people.
Yeah.
So he kind of like evolved his the types of stories he tells to tailor to how he likes to draw.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't push himself out of that. Out of his style, which is fine. His style is wonderful, but if you see a kid's book by him, it's going to look like it's going to be slightly maybe cartoonier, but it's still going to feel like really, really like his work.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Whereas if we do something like we'll do a animated cartoon for a client, and it's going to this is for 12 to 17-year-olds, and if we do a different cartoon for 2 to 6-year-olds, it's going to look totally different, and we're going to find something that fits that story a little bit better.
Right.
It's tougher for us to grow in a linear direction as an artist, I think, because of that. But I think it also has really broadened like our influences and what we bring into our work, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. I agree. So that's perfect. So in terms of influences and stuff, who are your biggest contemporary inspirations in regards to craft?
Okay.
both in terms of like sequential art or just in general art?
So in sequential art, I've got a lot, but like Mike Mignola is one of them. But like Sarah Pichelli, Becky Cloonan, Travis Charest, Olivier Copiel, Mobius, Walt Simonson, Dave McKean, Adam Hughes, Brett Lewis, J.P. Leon, Alan Moore is not a artist. Well, he does draw and stuff, but he writes. But he changed the way stories are told in comic books, and he's just such a good storyteller. Like I always look back to his stuff.
Hmm.
Stuart Immonen is amazing. Mike McCone, John Byrne, Jack Kirby, and then the early guys who didn't have any other comic artists to look at are still some of the best. So like Winsor McKay and Alex Raymond, because they were drawing from real life. They weren't drawing from other comic artists or generations of comic artists. So they made their own solutions for like, how am I going to draw a tree instead of looking at another artist? They like, I'm just going to draw. I've been drawing real trees for years, and their stuff is still like unparalleled. And it's like I look back to those guys a lot. And then outside of it, I like a lot of like mid-century American illustrators, or like that kind of renaissance of American illustration. So like Leyendecker and Rockwell and Arthur Rackham and John Singer Sargent, and like older like classical artists like Michelangelo and Rodin, and contemporary I like James Jean and Ian McCaig. Hope Gangloff is this amazing artist. She does these like pen and ink, just like ballpoint pen illustrations of real people. They're just like
Cool.
mind blowing. And Swoon, she's a street artist. I really love her stuff. So those are my like for personal comic illustration and personal illustration. Those are like my go-to people. Like, and then for design and all that stuff, I've got books and books and like tons of like mental people that I'm just like, oh, those are the people that I look for if I want to do, sexy poster design or whatever.
Yeah, I actually don't have influences. I just ask you who I should be influenced by.
Who influences me, Kelly? Okay, well, your work looks like this and this and this, so these guys do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've sort of discovered vicariously through your knowledge who I like and what I like. I always appreciate that.
Well, it's good. I mean, a lot of your influences are ones that are up there too, but I just don't have 10 hours for unlimited podcast of Kelly's influences.
Yeah. We'll do another one day of you just listing people.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like I'm inspired by you and your growth, and we have some close friends art-wise that inspired me too.
For sure.
So Kelly Goodine has been a mentor of mine, and he's a video game guy now, but he did one comic that I feel didn't do him justice. But he's always been a huge influence of mine. And then our buddy Nick again was like he inked awesome. My first published comic cover that I did for this zine called Purgatory, and so he inked the cover. So the cover, my first thing, looks better than it should be. Our buddies inked it.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah. So what tips do you have for illustrators struggling to move forward in the development of their craft?
Just draw. Stop learning and just start doing. Like you're going to learn through the doing. I default to research and reading about art, and I get sucked into Pinterest holes and learning about influences. Like, well, who influenced this artist? I like him, but like Rockwell, I didn't know. He looked at Leyendecker a lot, and it's like, well, who did Leyendecker look at? I mean, I can go down those rabbit holes, but the biggest thing where I find growth is when I just sit my butt down and I draw, and to do that constructive like practice where you draw, but then you look at what's wrong with it and how to improve upon it. If just drawing without thinking about it is not going to help it, you got to do that kind of like that thoughtful practice. It's good to be a lifelong student, but don't forget that unless you have the courage to make the stuff, you're just going to be a student and you're never going to make anything. I think the problem that we all have is that we want to sit and learn until it's going to be perfect before we make something. But no matter what, it's not going to be perfect like you imagined it. So just make some stuff, and it'll get a little bit better each time.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good. And I mean, there's so when like just sitting like for example, let's say I took just made a project for myself. I'm gonna like I buy three sketchbooks and it's like I'm just gonna fill these sketchbooks. If I sit down and I just draw like emojis and fill it with doodles,
Yeah.
like is that like when I just want to like sort of expand on that a little bit. When you're saying like draw lots, you're not meaning like just sit and draw whatever, but like apply yourself to seeing, right? Like looking at
Yes.
stuff and trying to
Yes.
understand how to render it correctly and
Yeah. So if you just draw and doodle, you're going to get better at that. It's going to feel more natural, and it's going to look looser, and you'll be developing a certain kind of loosey goosey kind of thing, but you're not going to be really growing in other areas. So it's like you first decide where you want to grow,
hmm
and then be like aware of it and be critical of
hmm
it. So sit down with a goal and say, okay, well, yeah, I've got three sketchbooks. Maybe one sketchbook I'm going to work on, for first or a couple times a week, and I'm just going to do like I want to get better at drawing people. So I'll just draw real people in that book from real life and try and learn as much as I can there. And the other book, maybe I want to get better at drawing buildings, and I'll draw some just studies from real life of buildings. And then then the third one is like maybe I want to just work on my composition. So I'll just play around, maybe an hour a week and just play around with like different things that involve composition, giving yourself some copying a master work just with rough shapes to figure out composition and how they did stuff. They have to be thoughtful about it. So if you're doing anatomy stuff or you're doing drawings of people, you're drawing from real life, but you're also kind of sitting back and analyzing what looks good about it, what looks bad, and you can supplement that with book learning if you want, and you want to go to a book and understand anatomy better and start copying from that and implementing that with your real life stuff, or just looking at like an anatomy textbook and saying, okay, where are the bones in the arm? I'll draw arm from real life, then I'll draw the bones, and then I'll try and draw one from memory or whatever that is. I mean, there's lots of different strategies for how to grow, but it has to be you have to be giving yourself constructive criticism as you do it. Otherwise, you'll just kind of
hmm
you'll learn a bit, but it'll be a really slow growth.
yeah. And if a young artist is like struggling, because I know for me, like I often can't see errors
Mm-hmm.
or where I need to grow or change things. And so I think like probably finding a network of other creatives that can give you honest and constructive feedback is like super essential.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, we have that as friends and being business partners with our studio. So I always throw stuff at you, and you throw it back,
hmm
and we can talk about that, and that really has helped me to grow. Uh, both of our wives are talented artists as well, and they're also super honest.
hmm
So when I do something good, and my wife says it's good, it makes me so happy. And if it's not good, she's like, "Oh, it's good, but that eye is weird." Or that needs to be changed, and I'm like, oh damn, she's right.
yeah.
So that's it. Like that honest, critical feedback is important.
Truth and
Uh,
love.
yeah, yeah, truth and love, and then also approaching things from with a mindset that's open to learning and that's
hmm
humble,
hmm
and that's where you excel above anyone I know. You take your ego out of the
Thanks.
equation.
I know I'm awesome.
Yeah, no. I mean, you take your ego out of the equation, even though you are also a multiple award-winning artist, and have been doing this your whole life and have dedicated yourself to being better at it. You are always humble, and you listen to what anyone says, and you don't discount them, even though they might be younger or less experienced or less of an artist. You don't discount their opinion because of that. You're open to that, and you're like, okay, well, what do you feel isn't working about this? Do you have any ideas of what would
hmm
make it better, or what would make it better for you? And you always listen to those. I mean, you don't have to implement those things, but I mean, you always listen and try and get that other perspective. And I think especially in the last like year or so, your work has really grown because you've been pushing yourself with other work, but you're just consistently open to learning about things.
Well, thanks. I think that's like one of the things that I don't know. As creatives, and we're constantly required to be creative, right, in our work.
Hmm.
And so sometimes we just have to do work, and we're always sort of going to have some sort of external motivator
Yeah.
pushing us. But I know, like for me, like I think there's, um, I don't know if that's like, I think that I don't want to be indelicate when I say this, but there's sort of like two levels of creative minds, right? There's like those that are kind of willing to get to a certain point and then just stagnate,
Yes.
and then there's others that are like, I don't think it's an honesty thing. It's maybe just an willingness to apply or desire to apply yourself, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I
Right?
think it,
And
it has to do with your goals too. I
yeah,
think
yeah,
you like not
that's true.
everybody just wants to be the best at whatever they do. They just want to do some work that they're proud
And
of
be
and make it.
successful
And
and make
uh,
money and
what's
yeah,
that?
just be successful and make some money and provide and whatever, right? Like
Yeah, like,
yeah,
and there's nothing wrong with getting to a professional, competent
that's
level.
true. Yeah,
And I think I think you and I sometimes with creatives we don't get when they're like, yeah, well, I don't want to know about that.
yeah,
I
yeah.
met a comic artist who's fairly talented, a couple comic artists, fairly talented, both of them. One, like when I was like, oh, cool, where did you learn this and this technique? And they let me know. And I'm like, cool, I've got, oftentimes I'll be like, I've got some notes from a lecture I went to that I felt really helped me. You want to see them. And a lot of artists that want to grow will want to see that. And the other artist was like, nah, I don't, I just do what I do. And that's it. And I'm like, yeah, and that's okay. It's like, oh, okay. His work in 5 years is probably going to look the same as it does now. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means like they've reached a point where they're like, you know what? No, I just like doing what I do, and I don't want to. That's a different kind of path,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And it's okay to be on. But I
yeah,
mean, for us, we're on that path where we just want to keep climbing that ladder. We don't know how tall it is, and let's just keep going. How can you help me get to that next
right,
run,
right, yeah,
Corey, or help me do this so that I can just get a little bit further.
yeah, for sure, absolutely. Well, that kind of wraps it up. Do you have anything else you want to add? Yeah, like a last word.
No, I think it's a crazy journey, trying to be good at something, but it's fun, and I think that's something that everyone needs to remember if they're working on their craft. Because if you're doing it as your day job, it gets really hard sometimes to find the time or to find that love again. But just sitting down and remembering that path to getting good at anything is actually really enjoyable, and just sitting down and being able
Hmm.
to allow yourself to enjoy it instead of putting that pressure that clients put on you or day to
Yeah.
day puts on you, and just saying, it's really good when you get those little moments of you learn something. I've been drawing for my whole life, and then I'll draw from a book, and it's like, well, that's how eyelid works. Oh, I've been drawing it wrong. This is awesome. This will help me. And you don't think that there's more to learn, but there's so much more. And you're like, oh, this is. You get those little bits when you have that time that just really remind you that, okay, yeah,
Hmm.
that path is wonderful and worth it. So yeah, just don't lose sight of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks a lot, man.
No problem.
This was awesome. Yeah, I'll let you go now, but I'm gonna stop the recording. But we can talk some more. But
All right.
yeah, thanks. It's awesome.
Hey, no problem. Thank you. It was really cool.
Thank you guys for listening to this interview. I encourage you to seek out Kelly Mellings on Twitter. He's at Kelly Mellings, KellyMellings. I will put a link in the liner notes. I also encourage you to take up some of the stuff that was talked about in the interview. If you're a struggling or a striving artist, or if you're just getting started, or you just want to grow, really consider some of the stuff we talked about during the interview and challenge yourself to consider some of those aspects of your creative journey. I hope that this has been valuable to you. I know every time I talk to Kelly and I get to share time with him, I learn something. And I hope that you have too. I'd like to take a moment just to thank my patrons on Patreon who are supporting my endeavor to write a story called Possum Awesome and the Tome of Tomorrows. Thanks, you guys. You're awesome. I'm looking forward to continuing to share the story with you and to continue to work at it. If you'd like to support the story, please visit me on patreon.com/ Corey Lansdell. And please subscribe here and leave a comment and a like. It really means a lot to me. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to this. Thanks so much. Until next time, be good to each other. So I'm going to be trying to make my YouTube channel a little bit more accessible. I'm going to be asking you, if you'd like, you can click one of the links on screen to watch a video that you haven't seen. If you'd like to subscribe, please click the subscribe button. And if you would like to leave a comment, I would appreciate it. I will check in with you guys next time. All right, take care.